start with you, Dr. Wang. I want to start with a comment that Larry Fink, Chairman and CEO of BlackRock, made earlier in the year. They were questioning him about the Ukrainian war with the Russians. And he said, well, you know, the age of globalization is effectively over, and we're going to be spending our time now uncoupling ourselves from each other. Do you believe that to be the case?
Well, yeah, thank you, Anthony. I think that, you know, certainly globalization is already at a crossroad, and we actually have a huge setback of the globalization. I think that, you know, this Ukraine war actually going on actually disrupted so much of the process of the globalization. And, but I still, however, I think that, you know, globalization will definitely continue. We have a huge setback. You know, it may slow down quite a bit, but I think the momentum, the old element, you know, the productivity, the cross-border trade, the investment, you know, all those tandem mobility will certainly continue. And also particularly, I think with the China and Asia is rising with all the regional agreement like RCEP, you know, like CPTPP are still continue. So I think the key is now you know, how we can really get a peaceful you know, conclusion of this war is really a challenge. I think that, you know, big countries, UN and EU, US, probably China, you know, including Russia and Ukraine, should sit down. Let's have a you know, 7-party talks. You know, I wrote a piece at the New York Times just in March, recommending that China should get involved. I'm pleased to see President Xi and President Biden meeting yesterday. Basically, President Xi said, you know, China still like to help to intervene and mediate, and if necessary. So I think that we need to really see the end of that. But I think the world has already changed so much. We are already a global village. I don't think we can go back to the old days of separation of different camps and different, you know, go back to the Cold War. Now the world economy is so intertwined. And so I believe that we have a setback, but it depends how we steer through this challenge and this difficult time. But I think if all the countries are really working together, and particularly China, US, and EU, are really think of the benefit of the world, and I think we can still you know, have an inclusive globalization, have a balanced globalization, and we still can go forward.
Nicolas, I thought our generation was going to fix things. Mm-hmm. I thought that we were going to make the world better. We were going to have more harmony. It was sort of like the Coca-Cola commercial when we were kids, everybody holding hands. What did I get wrong? And why weren't we able to fix things? And where do you think things are going from here?
Again, just to emphasize what Dr. Wang said, I mean, I hope we don't go back in terms of like deglobalization. I mean, there were so many benefits that the world achieved by, you know, globalizing, by being able to focus on the areas where, you know, we're strong. And you know, we're of course putting a lot of effort from the financial point of view to try to make sure that you know, East and West come together, and there's more and more that can be done. Part of it is that, of course, when you have an emerging power, I mean, there's always something that would happen. So it's natural, and if we just like assume that Asia as a region over the next 10 years will represent probably like about half of the output of the world. I mean, it's bound that you're going to have some rocky moments, because it's a big shift. I mean, there's a big shift of, you know, power and influence from west to east, and I mean, I don't think we're going to have like a complete deglobalization. It's really too hard. The benefits of globalization are too big. And it's not just to one region. I mean, that kept prices very low around the world in a lot of areas. It helped productivity. I hope we don't get there in technology, and definitely we're working very hard on the financial side to make sure that we continue having opportunities all over the world, that we have this capital mobility that is, you know, so important to get prosperity. Now, if we look at the last 4 years, I know the rhetoric has been really, okay, we're separating, we're not going to rely. But if you look at the numbers, I mean, let's take up, for example, global share of manufactured goods exports. China in 2017 used to represent 17%. Today, it's over 21%, and it's at the all-time high.
And going higher.
And, well, I mean, I think it's going to continue evolving. Clearly, China is like the key partner or number one partner for a lot of countries around the world. So what I think will happen is just like private companies. I mean, when you're in a company, you have to make sure that you have like alternatives, that you have like a plan, you have resiliency. To make sure that you do that, you have to have several sources. So probably we won't have a situation where someone is depending on just one country, one area, and there'll be more of a diversification. But let's take once again the financial sector. I mean, if we take the financial sector, how much of the global assets under management in the world are today invested in the mainland, in China? It's very little, actually. Yeah. Out of $120 trillion, $130 trillion in assets under management, the allocation to Asia is about $1.5 trillion. So it's 1%. I mean, it's tiny for a country that represents about 18% of the global economy. So I actually think that we're in the early stages of financial integration between China and the world. So I think that will continue. There will be people looking for different supply chains. At the same time, China is also evolving, and maybe they evolve into higher value-added products as well. So we'll have to see.
Dr. Wang, 6 or 7 years ago, the United States was embarking upon TPP. And there was a discussion about a pivot to Asia and a need for the U.S. to have a different geopolitical footprint in Asia. Did we get it wrong by not adopting that treaty? And is there a way to correct it if we got it wrong?
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Actually, Anthony, you know that U.S. is always the driver of the globalization and always taking the lead of the globalization. I mean, you look at the Bretton Woods system. Basically, U.S. has helped to establish, you know, the World Bank, IMF, WTO, and all those has actually made the world into prosperity in the last 7 decades. It was really pity to see that U.S. is pulling out of the TPP, which they actually have set at higher standards for the global trade, including digital economy and also liberalization of a trade and facilitation of the investment. And somehow, I mean, of course, Japan and Australia take a lead on that. And China, actually, we've been able to convince China. I mean, our think tank, Center for China Globalization, was a big supporter of China joining the TPP. And then we actually, had China now announce China is willing to join TPP. So I think it's more like a mini WTO. I mean, when WTO was paralyzed somehow during the Trump era, this TPP as a regional can really facilitate the liberalization. So I really hope that we can have the U.S. coming back to TPP, CPTPP now, and maybe also even deeper. You know, the digital partnership, economic partnership, which is proposed by Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile. And so I think that we still need to go back to more economic alliance, like RCEP, CPTPP, you know, that Belt and Road, probably B3W, and all those, rather than we have a lot of a security alliance now. You have NATO expanding, but also you have, Five Eyes, you have, AUKUS, you have Quad, you have all those security all beefed up. So I think it's not really good if we have more economic alliance beefed up. That'd be really great. So I hope that U.S. now have settled this midterm. Probably we can get more, towards the economic global alliance rather than we have a lot of security, military, defense alliance. I think, which will make us more and more dangerous to the world. So really hope that. Of course, China is willing to work with all the countries to make sure those economic alliances are really put a lot of prosperity and security in the future.
The Hong Kong Stock Exchange, you had this fabulous career at J.P. Morgan. There's something you see about the future of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange that caused you to move over there. Tell us about the future of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Where's it going?
Yeah, I mean, it was 31 years at J.P. Morgan, so a long time there, and I loved working.
You should be like me. I mean, lie about your age. It's only 10 years.
So, I mean, and it was a great experience and everything, and worked in many continents. But what I see, and what was the interesting thing about Hong Kong Exchange, and what are the key things to focus on in the future. And these things, while people kind of know, hasn't been sufficiently discussed a lot. I mean, one of them is that for anyone that loves finance and is interested in finance, what's going to happen in capital markets in this part of the world is something humanity has never seen. In a period of 10 years, I strongly believe that the capital markets of China will increase from about $30 trillion today to over $100 trillion. We'll see this over the next 10 years. We'll have some years that are tough, and this is clearly one of the tough years. But that's inevitable because the savings power is so huge, the household savings and the household wealth that you have in China, it's huge. And a lot of that is focused on two areas. One, real estate, people saving bricks, I mean, in their homes, and in bank deposits. There's new regulation around pension funds, asset management. As that starts to change, capital markets will become really, really big. So even if you assume like reasonable growth in China of like 3-4%, and you assume like an inflation of 2 to 3%, over the next 10 years, China will double its GDP. So it'll go from about 16, 17 trillion to around 35 trillion in the next 10 years. And then if you think about capital markets as a percentage of GDP, that should, in any reasonable country, be 300-400% of GDP. So you can see the numbers getting there. As that happens, it creates an incredible opportunity because not only because that market is growing really fast, but then the velocity, the turnover of that market is evolving very quickly. And then the interaction, today about 3-4% of that market is either international investors in China or Chinese investors internationally. As that number, which is only 3-4%, grows to something more reasonable, because as I mentioned, the world is massively underinvested in China, and China is massively underinvested in the world, you're going to see like so much flow cross-border and interaction. And being in the middle, you're in Hong Kong, so it's the most international city of China and the most Chinese city outside of the mainland. So it's like really a privileged point of view, a privileged position to be in there. So for anyone like you or I that we love finance, to be in the middle of that, it's amazing. And on top of that, to the point that Dr. Wang mentioned, I mean, to the extent that we have more interactions between East and West, that helps keep the dialogue open. That helps, this type of conversation to go on. And the more that people interact, the more that people talk, less chances that we'll have a problem. So I was very encouraged by the conversations between President Xi and President Biden yesterday. I think it's positive that there's dialogue. They spent over 3 hours together. Clearly, what I do every day is spending time with investors from all around the world. About 75% of the investors in our derivatives markets are international investors. So we just have to keep the dialogue going, and that was the main attraction.
When President Biden last night in Bali, he said that the two countries are competitors, but the intonation when he was speaking was it was a respectful competition between the Chinese and the Americans, and I think the market's actually reflecting that today, that people do believe that there can be some kind of respectful competition without an antagonization. How does the Russian government fit in? Is the Russian government a competitor to the West or to the East? Or how do you see the Russian government, and how do you see that on the geopolitical landscape in terms of its position relative to the US and China?
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. I think that Russia probably, of course, militarily it's a big power, but then they really has a huge challenge and difficult time now in Ukraine. So I think they are really in a very awkward position, and I think where it's time that international efforts come together to really stop this war and bring an end to this war is really very much needed. But in terms of China's position with Russia, I think China attaches great importance to the international economy because China is the largest trading nation with 130 countries, largest trading nation with Europe, ASEAN, and many other countries. And Russia is only account about 1% of GDP. Its GDP is less than the province of Guangdong in terms in China. So I think that economically, China has a huge interest, a vital interest with the rest of the world. So I would think that you are right. The China-U.S. relation should be a healthy, competitive relationship, like Olympic style. Let's compete peacefully, rather than confrontation, and also only defined as a competition. Because also there are a lot of cooperation, for the climate change and for the pandemic, for the energy crisis, and of course also digital development in the world. So I think particularly also for the global South, the U.S., China, EU should really work together. So I think there's a there's a lot of things that U.S., China needs to work together, rather than we're really decouple of each other. For example, U.S. now has put 1,000 Chinese company on some kind of entity or watchable list down, whereas China has basically done none. China is really very reserved and very accommodating. So I think even for the 20th Party Congress report we just seen released, is still calling for opening up again and again and wider. So I would think that the policy, the continuity of China opening up will continue. And of course, China has to prepare for those worst days, if they are really sanctioned too much and prepare for that. But I think that as long as the two leaders are meeting, I'm glad that Secretary Blinken is also going to Beijing now, and let's sit down and talk. And so I can't see how the largest economy and second largest economy not get along. And also, as Nicolas mentioned, there's a huge opportunity for Chinese company to invest overseas and for foreign company to invest in China. That potential is still unleashed. We still need a lot of work to make that happen.
Just one supplement, around this angle of competition, because I hear that word a lot, like the strategic competition and all that. Now, what's interesting, from Hong Kong, we do have an opportunity to interact a lot of people from the mainland. I've been in the mainland, most of the month of April and part of May, and so have an opportunity to hear thoughts from different sides. What's interesting is I don't hear a lot of conversation about competition with the US. I just don't hear a lot. There's a lot of how can we develop our people. There's a lot of how can we double GDP per capita by 2035. How can we make sure that we continue seeing growth of GDP. But really, from a pure China point of view, there's not a lot that you hear on a day-to-day basis. Okay, how can we be the #1 in the world? How can we be ahead of? There's not this relative thing. So you hear a lot more of that when I speak with my colleagues in the US, in the West. Clearly you do hear a lot more. But the focus, I think, continues to be a lot in terms of development, making sure that there's development and progress.
This is an opinion of mine, so forgive my editorialization. I'd like to get both of your reactions to it. I sometimes feel that the Western media has a tendency to exaggerate the divide. Let's say that I put each of you in this position. I'll start with Dr. Wang and then move to you, Nicolas. I put you in the position where I wanted you to speak to the top 50 Western business leaders about China under President Xi with this new consolidation of power. And all of us on this dais recognize the need for this global interdependence and peace and prosperity among the two nations. So what advice would each of you give to those global leaders? What would you say?
Well, I think that, if they read the 20th Party Congress report carefully, I think there are several things that probably they should need to pay attention to. First of all, China is going to double down its efforts on the globalization, but also the modernization. So by 2035, by 2049, China is going to build a modernist society, which means there's a huge potential for enlarge the Chinese middle class. I think they're going to have a much more industrial base and also be more opportunities. And then another thing is the common prosperity. But the common prosperity doesn't mean it's going to deprive the rich and and just aid the poor. Basically means that China has lifted 800 million people out of poverty. But what about 300 million migrant workers in the city? You know, they're going to upgrade them into middle class. And China already have a 400 million middle class, which is already largest in the world. But what about remaining 1 billion? You know, still going to be upgraded. Sure. So there's a lot of things that China trying to avoid, that the polarization and rich get rich, poor gets poor, that kind of a deglobalization momentum. So I think China is doing that. And thirdly, I think also China has basically wants to continue to open up. And that's the policy, that's the benefit. China has been prosperous for the last 4 decades. It's because China opened up and reformed. So I think that will not be really left. But also, you look at the new team members promoted. You know, 4 new members promoted to the standing committee of the top elite leadership. They all come from very developed areas. Basically, they have the experience of cultivate private business. For example, the number 2 guy, he's from Zhejiang, where he cultivated Alibaba, and then he's in Shanghai. He imported the Tesla. So those 4 people are really all from developed area, Guangdong and Jiangsu and all those areas, Shanghai. So I can see they can be more, apply their experience, supporting the private sector and supporting the multinationals for investment. So we see, I think there's a lot of things could happen that for the positive side. I think you're right, you know, the Western media probably reads too much into the negative side of it, but I think it's really, that we'll see now President Xi finally got his own team in place now. I mean, any leader will choose his own cabinet, like Western countries. And now he probably will have a more, asserted, narrative on the globalization. But China also, emphasized quite a bit of a security. But that is really in responding to what the environment they are facing. As I said, 1,000 companies has been sanctioned. There's not the new decoupling on the semiconductors, everything. So China has to do it on its own in some way, because you're forced to. And also the relationship between China and Russia was sometimes forced to as well. So I think if US and China sit down and talk, we can see a better improvement, and we can see a better stabilization, and probably better media reading into that. We started that happening now. Chancellor Scholz just had a big delegation of business going to China. So US-China's top leader are meeting, and we see Blinken going. So let's have all the dialogues, and let's hope for the best.
What would you say, Nicolas?
Yeah, I think that to understand what's going on, and I'm a foreigner, like living in Hong Kong and expat, so I have to try to simplify the messages a bit. I would say focus on the things that are important to them, and I'll just mention 5. 1, they're laser focused on development. Now, just like be careful to have the labels of common prosperity and all that. What they want to do is they want to see society develop. They want to see society evolve. I don't attach a meaning to common prosperity of we won't allow any rich person. Just before taking this job, I was heading the international private bank. We have more billionaires come every week, and still we see that. There's a lot of billionaires being minted in China all the time, and I'm not even counting all the 100 million, 150 million, 50 million. So there's not a sense of we don't want people to get rich. There is celebration around people that are successful. And so the issue of development is very, very, very important. Secondly, connectivity. China wants to stay connected to the world. They thought that it's becoming more insular and perhaps closing down. You can just assess all the international banks that are getting licenses all the time. They used to be able to hold maximum 30% of an international securities company. Now they can have 100%, same in the asset management side. We look at Hong Kong Exchange. We're getting so many things around ETF Connect, Swap Connect, the possibility of international companies to list in Hong Kong and be qualifying for Stock Connect. So that's very important, that connectivity. The third one, modernization of the financial system. It has been repeated over and over. The market as the main source of allocation of resources and the importance of the market, they still believe that there is a very important efficiency that is generated about the market being the main allocation of resources and using the markets to distribute some of those resources, since a lot of today go through the banking system, the financial markets. And so when we see the real estate sector, actually, I think that one of the issues why they perhaps were a little hesitant to intervene a little earlier is because they wanted to let the market to define who succeeds, who wins. I mean, now they're putting a little more emphasis because they want to make sure that it's not systemic. And then the other thing is technology. They don't want to miss the wave of technology. Like in the Industrial Revolution, I mean, clearly many countries in the West, they took over. I mean, that was very beneficial for many years. They want to make sure that they're at the forefront of the technology revolution. That's why there's so much emphasis about making sure that there's policy support and emphasis on technology. And lastly, sustainability is huge. I mean, there's a lot being done there.
So we have a few minutes to go, so I'm going to create a little bit of rapid fire questions, if that's okay. I want to start with the current equipoise in the environment and Taiwan. Do you believe that the United States and the Chinese government will stay in the current position geopolitically related to Taiwan? Dr. Wang.
Yeah, no, I was very pleased to see President Biden, last night give a news conference after his talks with President Xi, basically saying he doesn't see an imminent plan of China to attack Taiwan. I mean, that he got out of that meeting. He has that kind of impression as well. I think that the issue of Taiwan is that China doesn't want to rock the status quo. Absolutely not, because China. Already, I think before President Tsai took over, China has a huge integration with Taiwan. There's millions of Chinese travel to Taiwan, and then there's Taiwan enjoys the biggest surplus with mainland, and then there's marriages between, and so I'm sure it will be eventually integrated together. The key is actually, we see some U.S. politicians basically, that keep sending their top legislators, congressmen, senators, even the third highest ranking officials like Nancy Pelosi made an official visit to Taiwan, where I think that's violating the fundamental principle of communicate. 3 joint communique China had with U.S. basically says, U.S. and China can maintain, Taiwan can maintain economic, commercial, and other non-official ties. So it's non-official ties. So I think, of course, China has to respond, has to do some exercise, has to really, but China did exercise only when Nancy Pelosi landed in Japan. I mean, so I think if they really constrain from both sides, I think Taiwan's status quo can be maintained.
When you're giving the pitch for the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and convincing great companies to come list in Hong Kong, is the status quo better for you? Isn't where we are right now better than something different?
Status quo from what point of view?
Meaning that it's a, what did they say? It's one country, two systems, or whatever they write appropriate diplomatic description of it.
I mean, of course, anything that avoids any conflict, I think it's good. I mean, we just want to make sure that dialogue and communication continues. But when I'm doing my pitch around Hong Kong Exchange, I mean, the key thing that I mention is, you go to Hong Kong, you have access to an international place where you have common law, rule of law, you have international institutions, you have a system with a very effective tax rate, and most importantly, and especially given the announcements that were recently made, that will allow international companies that list in Hong Kong to be accessible by investors from the mainland. So Hong Kong will be the only place in the world that will have access to investors from the mainland, which, as you know, it's a very, very enthusiastic investor base. They invest a lot. I mean, the liquidity in the onshore exchanges is 1 trillion RMB per day. So that capital will have access to companies that list in Hong Kong. And in addition to that, you have all the international community, because over 80% of the largest 100 banks in the world, they have a presence in Hong Kong, they have a base in Hong Kong. Hedge funds, there's like over 500 hedge funds. There's like $5 trillion US dollars under management in Hong Kong. So all this pool of capital, international and from the domestic markets from the mainland, all of those will be accessible in just one market in the world. No other market gives you that.
It's a great statement. Dr. Wang, did the midterm elections help President Biden this week in his conversations with President Xi?
Well, I think it's great that both leaders emerging from the domestic agenda really have a better than expected results, basically. I think particularly U.S., you can see the deglobalization, the populism, nationalism, particularly led by Donald Trump, is not really going anywhere. And I think in the end, the people, common sense will come back, and then they'll elect politicians that really represent their interests and for the sake of the country and the world. So I think that so I'm quite interested to see the outcome, and I think if that kind of positive outcome comes out, we'll give President Biden a more leverage, and I'm sure President Xi has also consolidated his position in China as well. So that will give two presidents much more to say about the bilateral relation. And then from what the summit we see last night, actually sent a very positive signals that we put a floor at the deteriorating, free-falling this bilateral relation. So I hope that both presidents will push this up, and their relationship, their friendship can really help these bilateral relations.
Just a couple minutes left, Nicolas. We were talking backstage about growing up in this industry. When I started in the industry, the stocks transacted T+5. Mm-hmm. We're now at T+2. You and I were talking backstage about a day where we're eliminating intermediaries and perhaps tokenizing the transactions and having it be T+0 or T+ several hours. Will that happen for the Hong Kong Stock Exchange anytime soon, in your opinion?
It'll take some time. Just like when for us settling an IPO is still 5 days in Hong Kong. This 2023, we're moving to 2 days. That required a lot of investments. To go from T+2 to T+0, pretty much, will take quite a bit of time, because today there's a huge infrastructure. I mean, every time there's a trade, somewhere between 10, 12, 13 people touch a trade, and it takes 48 hours to settle. But that has been an infrastructure built over decades, a long time. Now, I know it's hard to talk about crypto these days, and it's painful to see a little bit of what's going on around, but the reality is that there's a lot to learn from the industry. Now, it cannot be done in a completely environment with no regulation and no oversight. There needs to be like a combination of things. So I do believe that if I think about the long term, we are going towards that, a market that is available 24 hours a day, where transactions settle immediately, where you can have multiple assets in one place. I mean, tokenization, all those things will happen. That's why our motto is we're building the marketplace of the future, but it'll take time.
Ladies and gentlemen, Nicolas Aguzin and Dr. Henry Wang, thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
It's a great conversation.
Thank you.
Really well.
Great.
Thank you, Anthony.
See you guys.
Great.